An empty food pantry that mirrored a town's broken hope, a powerful man who declared their faith officially bankrupt, and a pastor's final desperate prayer for a miracle of provision before the sun came up. If you believe that God is the God of abundance, even when our hands are empty, like this video and subscribe. This story is a powerful testament to his faithfulness. The air in the community hall of Grace Chapel was heavy and cold, not from the autumn chill outside, but from the weight of despair. The worn wooden pews were filled with the small congregation, their faces etched with worry. This was not a Sunday service, it was a final desperate meeting. For months their small town had been ravaged by economic hardship. The local factory had closed, and now the ripple effect had reached the very doors of their church. At the front of the hall, standing at a simple wooden lectern, was Arthur Harrison. He was the town's wealthiest man, a real estate developer, whose portfolio included the very land the church stood on. He was also the chairman of the church's finance committee, a position he wielded with the unsentimental precision of a surgeon. "The numbers, my friends, do not lie," Harrison announced, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. He gestured to a chart he had set up, showing a cascade of red ink. "We are insolvent. The food pantry has been empty for 2 weeks. The collection plate is barely covering the electricity bill, and the final mortgage payment is 30 days past due. As of tomorrow morning, the bank will officially begin foreclosure proceedings." A collective gasp of pain went through the hall. This church was more than a building. It was the heart of their community, the last place of refuge in a town that was slowly dying. Harrison's cold gaze then fell upon the man sitting in the front pew, Pastor Daniel. He was a man in his 40s, with kind eyes that now looked weary, his shoulders carrying the weight of his entire flock. "Pastor Daniel," Harrison continued, his tone dripping with condescension, "has suggested a different approach. He has called for a night of prayer and fasting. He believes that if we just have enough faith, a solution will magically appear." A few of Harrison's allies on the committee chuckled softly. The rest of the congregation looked down at their hands, a mixture of shame and fading hope on their faces. "I am a man of pragmatism," Harrison declared, positioning himself as the voice of reason against the pastor's supposed delusion. "Faith is a wonderful sentiment, but it does not pay the bills. It does not stock a shelf, it does not stop a bank from seizing its property." He then delivered his public, cruel challenge. "So, I will make you all a final offer. I will personally halt the foreclosure for 24 hours, but on one condition." He locked eyes with Pastor Daniel. "You have your night of prayer, you appeal to your higher power, and by the time the sun rises tomorrow, I want to see this provision you speak of. I want to see the pantry shelves full of food. If they are, I will not only stop the foreclosure, I will personally pay off the rest of the mortgage." A flicker of hope went through the crowd, but it was quickly extinguished by Harrison's final words. "But if those shelves are still empty at dawn," he said, his voice turning to ice, "then we accept reality. We hand over the keys to the bank. The food pantry is closed for good, and we all agree that this experiment in blind faith is over. Do we have a deal, Pastor?" It was a public execution of hope. He was using their own faith as a weapon against them, setting an impossible task to prove, once and for all, that their beliefs were powerless in the real world. The congregation looked at their pastor, their faces pleading, searching for an answer. How could he possibly agree to such a thing? But Pastor Daniel simply rose to his feet. He looked at the worried faces of his flock, then at the smug, challenging face of Arthur Harrison. He did not argue. He did not protest. He just gave a quiet, solemn nod. What no one in that room knew, what even Harrison with all his logic couldn't factor in, was that this was not the first time Pastor Daniel had stood in an empty room with nothing but a promise from God to see him through the night. But who was this man who would wager the future of his church on a single night of prayer? Before he was a pastor facing down a public challenge, he was just Daniel. Pastor Daniel's life was woven into the very fabric of the small town of Oak Haven. He hadn't been assigned to Grace Chapel by a distant bishop. He had been born and raised in this community. He had been baptized in its font, married his high school sweetheart Sarah at its altar, and now he was shepherding the same families who had watched him grow up. His small, cluttered office at the back of the church smelled of old books, coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of Sarah's lemon pound cake, which she brought to every church event. He was not a charismatic orator or a fiery preacher. His sermons were simple, heartfelt conversations, drawn from his own life and the struggles of his congregation. He was known for his quiet compassion and his tireless work ethic. He was the first to arrive at the church and the last to leave. He was the one who would show up with a toolbox to fix a widow's leaky faucet, the one who would sit for hours by a hospital bedside, the one who knew every child's name and their favorite Bible story. His life was a testament to his belief that faith was not a Sunday morning activity, but a Monday through Saturday practice of love and service. The church's food pantry, now empty, had been his passion project. He had started it years ago in a small closet with a few cans of soup and a deep conviction that no one in his town should go to bed hungry. He believed the church was meant to be a lighthouse, a beacon of practical help and spiritual hope. But the economic downturn had hit Oakhaven like a slow-moving hurricane. The factory closure had been a devastating blow, creating a domino effect of lost jobs, lost homes, and lost hope. The food pantry, which once served a dozen families, was now overwhelmed by hundreds. The collection plate dwindled as his congregation, generous to a fault, now had little left to give. The summons to the finance committee meeting had been inevitable. For weeks, Arthur Harrison had been making his position clear in private conversations. He spoke of fiscal responsibility, hard decisions, and the need to be realistic. He saw the church as a failing business, a property with potential for redevelopment. He viewed Daniel's insistence on keeping the pantry open and trusting in God's provision as irresponsible and naive. "Daniel," Harrison had said to him a week before, in the cold, impersonal setting of his real estate office, "You are a good man. But you are not a businessman. You are leading these people on a path to sentimental ruin. Sometimes the most responsible thing to do is to admit defeat and cut your losses." Daniel had simply replied, "Arthur, the church is not a business to be liquidated. It is a family, and you never give up on family. God has not given up on us." It was this quiet, unshakable refusal to bow to a worldly financial logic that had infuriated Harrison. It was a direct challenge to his entire worldview, where everything could be measured, calculated, and controlled. He had engineered the EEK public showdown at the community hall for one reason: to force Daniel and everyone else to finally concede that faith had its limits, and that those limits were defined by the numbers on a balance sheet. What Harrison failed to understand was that Daniel's faith was not based on the numbers he could see, but on a profound, life-altering experience with a God who had already taught him the true meaning of provision in the loneliest, most desolate place imaginable. What Arthur Harrison, with his charts and his bottom-line thinking, could never calculate was the true source of Pastor Daniel's quiet strength. His faith was not a hopeful theory learned in seminary. It was a hardened, tested reality, forged in the crucible of a personal desolation so profound it had nearly extinguished his own soul. His certainty was not born in a time of plenty, but in a time of absolute, soul-crushing lack 20 years earlier. The memory was a ghost that still walked with him, a constant reminder of the man he used to be. He was just Daniel then, a young man in his early 20s, living in a sprawling, anonymous city far from the gentle hills of Oakhaven. He was not a pastor. He wasn't even sure he was a believer. He had a degree in business, a sharp mind, and a burning ambition to make a name for himself in the cutthroat world of finance. He worked as a junior analyst at a prestigious investment firm, a place where success was measured in decimals and morality was a flexible commodity. His faith, a relic from his small-town upbringing, was something he kept packed away, like an old childhood sweater, something that no longer fit his new sophisticated life. He attended a massive impersonal church on Christmas and Easter, more out of a sense of nostalgic duty than any real conviction. His God was the market, his scripture was the Wall Street Journal, and his prayers were whispered hopes for a rising stock index. He was confident, successful, and completely, utterly lost. He was married then, too, to a woman named Jessica. Theirs had been a whirlwind romance, built on the shifting sands of ambition and city life. They had a beautiful high-rise apartment with panoramic views, a life that looked perfect from the outside. But inside, it was hollow. Their conversations were about promotions, bonuses, and social climbing. Their connection was as superficial as the polished chrome in their designer kitchen. The first crack in his perfect hollow world appeared on a Tuesday morning. He arrived at work to find chaos. The market had taken a sudden catastrophic downturn overnight. His firm, which had been heavily invested in high-risk derivatives, was wiped out. By noon, security guards were escorting employees out of the building with their belongings in cardboard boxes. Daniel stood on the sidewalk, his box in his hands, staring at the glass tower where his future had been just hours before. He was jobless. The financial collapse was just the beginning. The job loss put an unbearable strain on his already fragile marriage. The arguments became more frequent, more bitter. He had built their identity on his success, and without it he was nothing in her eyes. 2 months later he came home to an empty apartment. A short, cruel note on the kitchen counter was all that was left of his marriage. "I can't do this. Daniel," it read. "I can't be married to a failure." He was alone, no job, no wife, and his savings were dwindling at an alarming rate. He had been so proud, so determined to make it on his own, that he had cut ties with his family and his old life in Oakhaven. He had no one to call, nowhere to turn. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He spent his days sending out resumes, and his nights staring at the ceiling of his empty, echoing apartment. The weeks turned into months. His savings ran out. He sold his car, then his expensive furniture, piece by piece, just to pay the rent, but it wasn't enough. The eviction notice was the final humiliating blow. He packed what little he had left, a few changes of clothes, some books, his now useless business degree, into a single suitcase. He was homeless. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt the cold, hard reality of true poverty. He spent a few nights in shelters, but the despair and the danger there were too much to bear. He ended up on the streets, just another anonymous face in the city's vast population of the forgotten. He learned the geography of hunger, the rhythm of soup kitchens, the cold that seeps into your bones when you try to sleep on a park bench. He, the man who once analyzed multi-million-dollar portfolios, was now counting loose change to see if he could afford a cup of coffee to stay warm. The experience stripped him bare. His pride, his ambition, his intellect, they were all worthless. Out here, he was reduced to a primal state of survival, and in that raw, desperate state, something began to stir within him. The faith he had packed away for so long. One night, huddled in a cold, damp alleyway, trying to escape a biting wind, he hit rock bottom. He was starving. He hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. He was shivering, sick, and overcome with a sense of hopelessness so profound it felt like a physical death. He saw no way out. He was going to die here, alone and forgotten. He closed his eyes not to sleep, but to simply give up. And in that moment of complete and utter surrender, he prayed. Not the transactional bargaining prayers of his old life. This was a prayer that was little more than a single broken word, a whisper from the deepest part of his soul. God. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a job. He didn't ask for a warm bed. He just spoke the name, acknowledging a presence he had ignored for a decade. God, if you are there, I'm so lost. He expected nothing. But as he knelt there, his forehead pressed against the cold, grimy brick of the alley wall, he felt a flicker of something. Not a voice, not a light. It was a memory, a feeling. It was the memory of being a child in Grace Chapel, sitting in a hard wooden pew, feeling a sense of peace and belonging that he hadn't felt in years. It was the memory of his grandmother telling him, "Daniel, no matter how far you wander, God's porch light is always on." Tears began to stream down his face, hot against his cold skin. They were tears of shame, of regret, but also of a tiny emerging spark of hope. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the darkness. "I am so sorry I left you. I thought I didn't need you. I built my own kingdom and it was made of sand. And now the tide has come in and it's all gone. I have nothing left. I am nothing." He stayed there for a long time, the prayer a continuous silent stream of confession and surrender. "My life is a wreck," he finally concluded. "I have ruined it. But if you can do anything with the broken pieces, then they are yours. I give them to you. I give me to you. I don't even know what to ask for anymore. I trust you." He had no idea what that even meant. It was a blind leap into a faith he had only ever viewed from a distance. He fell into a fitful, exhausted sleep, still kneeling in the alley. When he woke up, the first grey light of dawn was filtering into the city. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He flinched, expecting a police officer or someone wanting to rob him. But when he looked up, he saw an old man with kind, weathered eyes and a gentle smile. The man was holding out a steaming cup of coffee and a warm bagel wrapped in a napkin. "You look like you could use this, son," the old man said, his voice soft. Daniel stared at him, speechless. He took the coffee, the warmth seeping into his frozen hands. "Thank you," he managed to choke out. I don't have any money to pay you." The old man just smiled. "This one's on the house. Sometimes a man just needs to know he's not invisible." He gave Daniel's shoulder a final, gentle squeeze and then walked away, disappearing into the morning mist. Daniel never saw him again. But in that moment he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core. That old man was not just an old man, he was an answer. He was the first light after the darkest night. He was the physical manifestation of the grace he had just thrown himself upon. It wasn't a lightning bolt from heaven. It was a cup of coffee and a bagel. It was a small, practical, life-saving provision. That single act of kindness was the turning point. It gave him not just physical sustenance, but the spiritual strength to take the next step. Later that day, he used his last bit of change to make a phone call. He called home. He called Oakhaven. He spoke to his parents for the first time in years, swallowing his pride and confessing everything. And all he heard on the other end of the line was love, forgiveness, and a simple invitation. "Come home, son. Just come home." He returned to Oakhaven not as the successful financier he had dreamed of being, but as a broken, humbled man. He had started his life over from scratch. He worked odd jobs, he reconnected with his community, and he began to study the Bible with a hunger he had never known. He had discovered that the true riches were not in a stock portfolio, but in a community of faith. He had learned that God's provision was not about wealth, but about receiving exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. It was this deep, personal and proven knowledge that now allowed him to stand in his own church, with empty shelves and a foreclosure notice, and declare with absolute certainty that God would provide. He had been in an emptier room before, and he had seen a miracle at dawn. And it was the memory of that cold alleyway, the taste of that life-saving coffee, and the profound certainty of a prayer answered at dawn that now filled Pastor Daniel with a peace that baffled everyone in the room. Back in the present, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the community hall, Arthur Harrison's challenge was not a threat. It was an opportunity. The congregation watched, their faces a mixture of fear and a desperate, flickering hope. They saw the impossible odds. They saw the empty pantry, the foreclosure notice, the smug confidence on Harrison's face. How could their pastor agree to this? It was a fool's bargain. Harrison, sensing the unease, pressed his advantage. He walked to the center of the stage, taking on the air of a magnanimous but firm leader. "I know this is difficult," he said, his voice laced with false sympathy. "But we must be realistic. We are a community, yes, but a community must be built on a sound foundation. We cannot build our future on wishful thinking." He turned to Pastor Daniel, his voice becoming sharper. "So, Pastor, the deal is on the table, a night of prayer and a tangible result by sunrise, or we face the consequences. What is your answer to your flock? Will you lead them in a final, futile gesture, or will you lead them in accepting the inevitable?" One of the older deacons, a man named George who had known Daniel since he was a boy, stood up, his voice trembling slightly. "Pastor, this isn't right. Harrison is setting you up to fail, to set us all up to fail. There's no shame in admitting we've reached the end of our road." The sentiment rippled through the room. People began to murmur their agreement. It was better to accept defeat with dignity than to be humiliated in this cruel public spectacle, but Pastor Daniel held up a hand, a gesture that was both calming and resolute. He walked to the front, standing not at the lectern of authority but on the floor on the same level as his people. "George, my friend," he said, his voice warm and steady, "you are right. There is no shame in reaching the end of our road. In fact, that is precisely where God's road begins." He looked around at the faces of his congregation, meeting their worried eyes. "For months we have tried to solve this problem ourselves. We have organized fundraisers, we have cut costs, we have pleaded with the bank. We have done everything in our own strength, and as George said, we have come to the end. Our cupboards are bare, our bank account is empty, our own efforts have failed." He paused, letting the truth of their situation settle in. "And I say to you now, thank God for that." A confused silence met his words. "Thank God we have finally been brought to a place where our own strength is not enough," he continued, his voice rising with a quiet, joyful conviction, "because now, and only now, can we see his strength. We have been trying to ask God to bless our plans. Tonight we will stop planning. We will stop worrying. We will simply get on our knees and invite the Creator of the universe to show us his plan." He then turned to Arthur Harrison. The condescending smirk was still on Harrison's face, but a flicker of confusion had entered his eyes. He had expected a debate, an argument, a plea. He was not prepared for this serene declaration of surrender. "Mr. Harrison," Pastor Daniel said, his tone respectful but firm, "and we accept your terms, but let me be clear about what you will be witnessing tonight. You will not be witnessing an experiment in blind faith. You will be witnessing a family who has come to the end of their resources, placing their complete and total trust in their Father." Then he did something that shifted the very foundation of the challenge, and since you are so concerned with evidence, I invite you to be a part of it. The doors of this church and the doors to our empty food pantry will remain unlocked all night. I invite you and anyone else who doubts to come and go as you please. Stand guard. Make sure there are no secret deliveries, no tricks. Watch us and wait with us. The challenge was now reversed. He was not just accepting the dare, he was inviting his accuser to be the primary witness. He was removing any possibility of doubt or claims of deception. He was laying his faith and the faith of his entire community completely bare before God and their greatest skeptic. The stage was set. The pantry was empty. The bank was waiting. And dawn was just a few hours away. The silence in the community hall was now one of profound anticipation. Pastor Daniel's bold invitation had transformed the nature of the night. It was no longer a trial. It was a vigil. Arthur Harrison, caught off guard but too proud to back down, simply gave a curt nod of acceptance. The stage was set. As most of the congregation moved into the main sanctuary to begin their night of prayer, a strange and powerful quiet settled over the church. The lights in the food pantry, a small stark room with nothing but rows of completely empty shelves, were left on, its unlocked door a silent testament to the pastor's challenge. Harrison, true to his word, did not leave. He pulled a chair from the hall and placed it in the doorway of the pantry, positioning himself as a guard, a sentinel of skepticism. A few of his committee allies joined him, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and smug certainty. They were there to watch faith fail. Inside the sanctuary, the atmosphere was different. There were no loud, emotional pleas. There were no frantic cries for a miracle. Led by Pastor Daniel, the congregation simply knelt, their prayers a low, steady murmur that filled the sacred space. They were not praying for a truckload of food to suddenly appear. They were not praying for a wealthy donor to write a check. They were praying for God's will to be done. They were confessing their fears, surrendering their anxieties, and placing their trust not in a specific outcome, but in the character of their provider. It was a quiet, desperate, and beautiful act of collective surrender. The hours crept by. 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. The moon cast long shadows through the stained glass windows. Outside the pantry, Harrison and his men sat, their initial confidence giving way to a restless boredom. They drank coffee from a thermos, their conversation a series of cynical whispers. "This is a waste of time," one of them muttered. Nothing's going to happen. The man's a fool. Patience, Harrison replied, his eyes never leaving the empty shelves. I want to be here when the sun comes up. I want to see the look on his face when he has to admit defeat. But as the night wore on, Harrison's certainty began to feel a little hollow in the face of the steady, unwavering murmur of prayer coming from the sanctuary. It was a sound of such deep communal faith that it seemed to create a pressure in the air, a sense of anticipation that was almost physical. Around 4:30 in the morning, when the sky outside was just beginning to shift from black to a deep, dark indigo, it happened. It did not begin with the rumble of a truck or the sound of footsteps. It began with a single car. A rusty old station wagon pulled quietly into the church's deserted parking lot. The driver, a woman no one recognized, got out. She looked around almost nervously, then opened the back of her car. She took out 2 grocery bags, heavy with cans and boxes, walked quietly to the unlocked door of the pantry, and placed them on the floor just inside. She didn't look at Harrison or his men. She simply bowed her head for a moment, then turned and drove away as silently as she had come. Harrison stared at the 2 bags, a frown on his face. A small charitable gesture, pathetic but not a miracle. But then another car came. This time it was a pickup truck driven by a local farmer. He unloaded 3 large crates of potatoes, apples and onions, stacking them neatly inside the pantry. Tador, he too nodded silently in Harrison's direction and left. And then another, and another. It was as if an invisible signal had gone out across the entire region. A steady, quiet stream of vehicles began to arrive. A baker from 2 towns over, his van filled with loaves of unsold bread from the day before. A group of teenagers who had pooled their allowance money to buy bags of rice and pasta. Their traveling salesman who just happened to have a case of sample-sized soaps and shampoos in his car and felt an inexplicable urge to turn off the highway. They came from all walks of life. People the church had never met. People from different denominations. People who hadn't been to church in years. None of them spoke to each other. They moved with a strange, quiet purpose, as if answering a call only they could hear. They would arrive, deposit their offerings of food, toiletries and supplies, and then leave. Harrison and his men sat in stunned silence, watching the impossible unfold. The 2 bags became a small pile. The pile became a small mountain. The mountain began to fill the first row of shelves. Then the second. The crates of potatoes were joined by bags of flour and sugar. The cans of soup were stacked next to jars of peanut butter. The scent of fresh bread began to fill the cold night. Here the phenomenon was so quiet, so orderly, so peaceful, that it was more unnerving than any loud, dramatic miracle would have been. There was no explanation. There was no central organizer. It was a silent, spontaneous flood of provision appearing out of the darkness. By the time the first true rays of dawn pierced the stained glass windows, the pantry was no longer empty. It was overflowing. Every shelf was packed to capacity. Bags and boxes covered the floor. It was more food than the pantry had ever held, even in its best days. The sound of prayer from the sanctuary finally ceased. The door opened, and Pastor Daniel emerged, his face serene. He walked towards the pantry, his flock following quietly behind him. He stopped and looked at the bounty before him. Then he looked at Arthur Harrison. Harrison was on his feet, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. The cynical, powerful businessman was gone. In his place was a man who had just witnessed the complete and utter dismantling of his entire worldview. He had stood guard all night to watch faith fail, and instead, he had become the primary, irrefutable witness to a miracle of quiet, overwhelming, and inexplicable abundance. But as the congregation gasped at the sight of the overflowing pantry, and as they began to whisper joyful, tearful thanks to God, Pastor Daniel did not rush to celebrate the victory. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed not on the abundance of food, but on the transformed face of Arthur Harrison. The sun was now streaming through the windows, bathing the scene in a warm, golden light. The air was filled with the scent of fresh bread and produce. The stark, cold reality of the night before had been replaced by the tangible, undeniable evidence of a promise fulfilled. The test was over. The verdict was in. The members of the Finance committee who had sat with Harrison all night were speechless, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe. The rest of the congregation began to embrace one another, their prayers of desperation having turned into exclamations of praise. "He did it," one woman wept. "God is faithful," another declared. All eyes eventually turned to their pastor, expecting a sermon of triumph. They expected him to look at Harrison and claim his victory, to remind him of his promise to pay off the mortgage. This was his moment to prove that faith had conquered pragmatism. But Pastor Daniel's focus remained on a higher purpose. He walked slowly into the pantry, his hand brushing against a sack of flour, his expression one of profound, humble gratitude. He then turned to face his flock, and more importantly, to face Harrison. "My friends," he began, his voice soft but clear, carrying a gentle authority that hushed the joyful chatter. "Look around you. Look at this incredible gift. Let us rejoice, not because we have won a challenge, but because our Father has reminded us of his love." He then looked directly at Arthur Harrison, his eyes holding not a trace of "I told you so," but an ocean of compassion. "Arthur," he said, using his first name in a way that was both intimate and disarming, "you came here last night to see if faith was real. You stood watch to make sure there were no tricks. You are the most important witness to what happened. Here." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I want you to understand something crucial. This," he gestured to the food, "is not the miracle. This is just the evidence. This is the aftermath." Harrison looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about, Daniel? It's impossible. Where did it all come from?" "I don't know," the pastor answered honestly. "I don't know the names of the people who came. I don't know what prompted them to drive here in the middle of the night. And that is the point. The true miracle didn't happen in this room. It happened in the hearts of dozens of strangers miles away. The miracle was the quiet whisper of the Holy Spirit that prompted a baker to load his van, a farmer to bag his potatoes, a teenager to empty his pockets. The miracle was God mobilizing an invisible, silent army of ordinary people to fulfill his promise to us. His lesson was as simple as it was profound. You were looking for a single loud thunderclap from heaven, but God's provision usually comes in the form of 100 quiet acts of obedience. He didn't just fill a pantry, Arthur. He reminded us that we are all connected, that we are all part of his larger plan. He used them to bless us, and in doing so, he blessed them. He walked out of the pantry and stood before Harrison. "The mortgage, that was your promise, and I know you are a man of your word. But the real payment due today is not one of money. It's one of understanding. The most valuable thing in this room is not the food on these shelves. It's the proof that when we come to the end of ourselves and trust completely in God, he moves in ways we could never imagine, using people we have never met to show us that his economy is not one of scarcity, but of infinite, surprising, and beautiful abundance." Pastor Daniels. Words settled over Arthur Harrison not like a judgment, but like a gentle, cleansing rain. For the first time, he was not hearing a challenge to his logic, but an invitation into a mystery far deeper and more beautiful than his balance sheets could ever capture. He looked at the faces of the congregation, no longer seeing them as naive, believers in a failing enterprise, but as a family who had just witnessed the faithfulness of their Father. He looked at the overflowing shelves, no longer seeing just groceries, but seeing 100 individual acts of quiet, inexplicable obedience. The world, which had always been so clear and logical to him, was now shimmering with a new, unseen dimension. Slowly he walked from his guard post at the door into the center of the pantry. He picked up an apple, its weight and coolness feeling real and solid in his hand, yet its presence there was utterly surreal. He, the pragmatist, the realist, was standing in the middle of an undeniable miracle. He turned to face the pastor and the waiting congregation. The sharp corporate mask he had worn for so long was gone. His voice when he spoke was quiet, hoarse, and stripped of all its former arrogance. "I have lived my entire life," he began, speaking not as a chairman but as a man, believing that what you can count is all that counts. I measured success in dollars, in assets, in property values. I looked at this church and I saw a liability, I saw a failing business. He shook his head, a look of profound regret in his eyes. I was blind, so utterly blind. I stood here all night, guarding against a deception, when the real deception was the one I was living in, the belief that I was in control, the belief that my resources were the only ones that mattered. He looked directly at Pastor Daniel. You said the miracle happened in the hearts of others, but I think another miracle happened here tonight. It happened in mine. He took out his checkbook, the familiar tool of his power, but it felt different in his hands now. I made a promise, and I am a man of my word. He began to write, his movements deliberate. The congregation watched in silence as he filled out the check. When he was done, he tore it from the book and walked over to Pastor Daniel, holding it out not as a transaction, but as an offering. This will pay off the mortgage, he said, but it feels like such a small, inadequate gesture for the lesson I have learned tonight. Pastor Daniel took the check, but then he did something unexpected. He held it up for the congregation to see, then he gently tore it in half. A collective gasp went through the room. Harrison stared at him, stunned. Arthur, the pastor said kindly, your promise is honored in your heart, that is enough. But this check and this is your money. The miracle this morning was not about one wealthy man solving our problems. It was about a community of humble people being used by God. That is the lesson we must remember. He put a hand on Harrison's shoulder. From now on, this church will not be saved by one man's wealth, but by the faithfulness of many. I invite you, not as a chairman, but as a brother, to be a part of that. Let us use this food to feed the hungry, and let us trust that when we need to pay the light bill, God will provide, just as he did today. Perhaps he will even use you to do it, not out of a deal, but out of a changed heart. It was an act of incredible grace. He was releasing Harrison from the public deal and inviting him into a more authentic relationship, both with the church and with God. Arthur Harrison, the man who had come to foreclose, stood in the middle of the abundance, tears welling up, in his eyes for the first time in decades. He had lost an argument, but he had gained a chance at a new beginning. And so a new day dawned for Grace Chapel, not just in the sky, but in its very soul. The food from the miracle at dawn was distributed throughout the struggling town, a tangible sign of God's love and the quiet obedience of strangers. The story of that night became a cornerstone of their community, a permanent reminder of God's faithfulness. Arthur Harrison, true to his word from a changed heart, quietly paid off the church's mortgage the following week, not as a settlement of a deal, but as his first act of genuine tithing. He became a different kind of leader in the church, one who led with humility and a newfound respect for the mysteries of faith. Pastor Daniel continued to lead his flock, his sermons now carrying the quiet authority of a man who had not only preached about God's provision, but had stood watch and witnessed it firsthand. He had proven that the greatest asset a church can have is not money in the bank, but a collective faith that dares to trust God in the empty spaces. If this story of God's surprising and abundant provision has filled you with hope, please like this video and subscribe for more powerful Christian stories. Each one is a testament that our empty hands are the perfect vessel for His infinite grace.